Hi folks, it's FPL General here recording my last 59th minute podcast of the season. This is the episode that I really don't want to do, but I said I would do it, so I better be true to my word. So I'm going to do a bit of a season review / lessons learned for next season. So going to talk a little bit about why I think things went so badly for me, some of the takeaways that I'm going to bring into next season. And then I've got some really good questions from Twitter as well. So I'm just gonna get stuck into it, because for me, the sooner I get stuck in, the sooner this is over, and I can just start enjoying my summer and forgetting about what happened this year. So looking at my game week history page, this has been my worst ever season. I finished on 2,147 points, which was 516k overall. So it was actually my worst ever season. Even when I think back to the early days on my season history, I had a couple of 200, 300, 400k finishes when I started playing the game, when I didn't take it as seriously as I do now. So it was very, very, very disappointing to finish even worse than I did when I didn't take the game as seriously as I do now. So 516k, awful rank for the high standards that I set for myself. This is the first time I finished outside the top 50,000 since the 2012-2013 season. So a season which has brought me back down to earth, which I think in a way is a good thing. Maybe I was getting too big for my boots and felt like every season was going to be a good season, and this fantasy malarkey is just easy. So I think in a way, having a bad season, I think there's a lot of positives that can be taken from it and a lot of lessons to be learned. So that's what I'm going to do, and hopefully come back stronger next season and come back a better FPL manager. Because I think no matter how many top 500 ranks you have, no matter how good your season history is, I think there's always lessons to be learned in this game. The game is always changing. So I think we always have to be on our toes, and move with the trends. So talking a little bit about points hits, just looking at how many I took this season, I took a -4 on 8 occasions. So I took -32 in total this year. I avoided -8s, -12s completely, didn't take any of them. So -4 was my biggest points hit at any point of the season. So that's probably pretty standard for me. 8 -4s. I think thinking back to last season when I did well, I think I only took 4 points hits. But again, it's much easier to take less points hits when you've got the right players in from the outset. So that was the reason for that. Looking at my chips, how the chips went. The first wildcard went very well. I played it in game week 5, and I rose from about 1.1 million to just under 200k over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks. So the early wildcard was successful. The second one, not so much. I played the second wildcard, I think it was game week 34. I'm pretty sure it was 34. And, I ended up, I think most of my arrows towards the end of the season were red arrows. So the second wildcard was a failure. And I've got a question later about whether maybe we should think about playing that wildcard earlier next season. So I'll talk about that when the question comes. Triple captaincy chip was a success. I played it on Mane in the single game week where he got his brace. Should have got a hat-trick hitting the post. Got a brace and got no bonus points. So in a way it was disappointing, but I think we have to call that a success, given that a lot of people were unsuccessful with their triple captaincy chip this season. The bench boost chip was pretty disappointing as well, as it often is for me. I don't ever remember having a very good bench boost. I played it in 35 this season, and my bench was Matt Ryan, who got 12, so that was good. But then the Southampton guys let me down. I think I had Valerie, Ward-Prowse and Danny Ings. I think they only got 5 or 6 points between them that week. So I'm calling that a failure of a bench boost. Matt Ryan makes it look better than it was, really. The free hit chip, I played it in 32 and I got 83 points. Now, 83 sounds good, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't amazing, because that that was a game week rank of 1.5 million overall. So really, when you're playing your free hit chip, you want to be getting a very high game week rank. So again, a pretty average chip there. So overall, probably a bit disappointed with how the chips went for me this season. So again, something to think about for the next campaign. Moving away from that now, I've noted down here a couple of reasons why I think things didn't go well for me this year. So I think one of the main ones was a lack of preparation and the lack of a plan going into game week 1. So when I think back to game week 1, I got married last summer. I got married on the 14th of July last summer. Was on a honeymoon then until around the 1st or 2nd of August. So when I got back, it was all a big rush. That was when my Patreon started to kick off as well. So, I got a lot of sign-ups late July, early August. So, I was putting in a lot of work for that and, trying to get up to speed with it. And, I didn't have time, basically. I didn't have enough time to prepare my own Game Week 1 team. So, I neglected my own planning. And, I ended up going into the season without having a set-in-stone plan / strategy, which I usually do. So what I ended up doing was I kind of just set up my team for the first 4 game weeks with a view to more than likely wildcarding early, and that's what I did end up doing. And not doing enough research in those early in pre-season, it definitely contributed to my poor start to the season. As I said, after 4 game weeks, I was 1.1 million overall, and I think I just never recovered from that bad start. I've got a question as well later about how important is a good start, so I'll come back to that as well. But yeah, I think that that is definitely one of the main reasons why I had a bad season, was a poor start, and that was because of a lack of preparation and the lack of a plan for the season. So that's something I'm definitely going to have going into the new season. Going to do a lot more research, a lot more tinkering than I did last season, and be well set up for the season in game week 1. Another reason why I think things didn't go well was something that a lot of people do nowadays, is overthinking and overmanaging. So with me going full time into fantasy football this season for the first time, it gave me way too much time to spend on FPL. Way too much time to look at my own team, to read content, to listen to podcasts. There's so much great content out there, but I definitely overdid it with the content. Spending way too much time with FPL on the mind, it just clouds your judgment completely and forces you maybe to make decisions that you wouldn't do if you were playing, more of a casual approach, which I think often can turn out to be the best way to play the game. So the main issue I found was, especially with my Patreon content, I made the mistake of not putting a limit on my highest level of Patreon, which was a WhatsApp level. So at one point I had 175 WhatsApp level patrons, which meant I had 175 one-to-one conversations going on Monday to Friday, looking at other people's teams, talking about their transfer ideas, bouncing ideas off each other. So when it came to Friday night then, for me to make my own team, especially, Fridays tended to be my busiest day with all the Patreon stuff. So when it came to sitting down on a Friday night with my own team, my head was absolutely fried. I'd looked at 150 other teams throughout the week, talked about loads of different, transfer ideas, combinations, captaincy, all this kind of stuff. And then when it came to my own team, I just didn't have a clear head. And I usually made, a lot of the time I made decisions, with a tired mind, and, just rushed moves. And talking about rushed moves, I think back to one in particular that was a very, very damaging part of my season. It was game week 8 when I sold Callum Wilson and David Silva for Arnautovic and Knockaert. And then over the next couple of weeks, Wilson and Silva scored 43 and Arnautovic and Knockaert scored 5. And that was a Friday night deadline, and I was in London on the Thursday for the FPL show. So I stayed in London the Thursday night, and then I was flying back on Friday. I think I was flying back about 1 o'clock, and then my flight was delayed for 2 or 3 hours in Heathrow. So I ended up not getting back to the house till about 5 o'clock, 5:30, and then the deadline was at 7 o'clock. And in the meantime, I had a backlog of Patreon work to get done. So then I ended up having to rush my transfers in the last 10 or 15 minutes. And that was when, that was the worst transfers I made of the whole season. Wilson and David Silva, two very good FPL assets. Yes, Wilson wasn't scoring goals, but his underlying stats were great and his fixtures were great. But because I had to rush my moves, I ended up making very, very poor decisions there, getting Arnie and Knockaert in. I think they were also playing that night, the Friday night. I think I talked Arnautovic up on the FPL show the day before, and I just was hell-bent on getting him in. But in hindsight, it was two awful transfers. So again, it's all... that comes down to rushing things and not spending enough time and making poor decisions without having a clear mind. What else do I want to say about overthinking and over managing? I think I've covered most of it there. I'll move on to the next thing I've noted down here is not sticking to my golden rule of patience. So a couple of examples there is one I mentioned there was Wilson. Good underlying stats and good fixtures, and getting too impatient because he didn't score for 2 or 3 games and then just shipping him out. I should have had more patience there because the signs were pointing to an upturn in form. The one time this season as well that I made an early transfer, I got sick of Alonso and he blanked against Newcastle, and I sold him on the Sunday night after that game for Alexander-Arnold, and then of course on the Tuesday we got news that Trent got an injury. So you can call that bad luck, but for me that is just me breaking my rule of patience. I've always waited until Friday night after all the press conferences. I like to have as much information as possible before I make my moves, and I let myself down there with that Alonso to Alexander-Arnold transfer. So again, next season it'll be back to tried and trusted patience. I never worry too much about team value, so I don't worry about making early transfers to build that team value. So I'll just be waiting until Friday night or even Saturday mornings next season for all my moves. Just more than anything else, it takes the frustration out of things like that Alexander-Arnold injury. Something else I think I was very weak on in 2018-19 was my captaincy picks. I just had a look at it this morning. So I'm calling a captaincy fail is where the captain scores less than 10 points. So my captain got me less than 10 points on 15 occasions. And when I say 10 points, I mean 5 times 2. So 15, I'm calling that 15 poor captaincy decisions, or I wouldn't say poor decisions, but 15 captaincy blanks in my eyes. So that number is way too high. If you're going to have a very good season, you don't want to have 15 per captaincy haul. So, a lot of people that season went for 15, 16, 17 game weeks at the start of the season, nailing their captaincy every week. And, that got them off to a great start, a great platform to build on then. So one of the key things I want to improve on next season is a much better return from my captaincy. So when I set out my strategy, my plan for the season in pre-season, a key aspect of that is going to be the captaincy. I'm going to be looking in. I think I've been guilty in the past of not looking, far enough ahead with, which players I want to captain. Pinpointing game weeks and pinpointing captains in certain game weeks. So I've probably always kind of just winged it a little bit with that and just gone week from week to week and captain the best option that I have in that given game week. But I think I've learned this season that captaincy is, I've always known captaincy is important, but I think it's one of the most important aspects of the game. And to have a good season, you need to get it right more often than not. So a key aspect for me is going to be, in my strategy, the captaincy is going to be central to any plan that I have next season. And any decisions I make, captaincy is always going to come into consideration. I've just noted down here as well, a scribble on the paper, too many crap FPL players. So when I think of crap FPL assets, I'm thinking of players that were in my team this season at various points. Ross Barkley, Knockaert, Pereira from Watford, and Theo Walcott. Now, looking back on the season, in hindsight, they're 4 players that never should have come into my side. Going on how I play the game, I tend to stick to tried and trusted FPL assets, players that won't get rotated, players that I, usually when I bring in a player, I hope that I won't have to sell them in the near future. But, all those 4 players, you could say bringing them in that you're probably 75% certain that you're going to have to sell them again in a couple of weeks' time. So that's just a lot of wasted transfers. And for me, my strategy is always to try and minimise transfers. So that was a failure on my part. Fell into too many traps this season with bandwagons. So that, again, that's another key aspect for me next season, is to avoid those kind of players. It takes a lot of discipline, I think, to avoid those kind of players, because there's always a lot of hype around the players, leading up to the game week, and you feel like, you convince yourself that they are a good option. You look at the stats and you read the stats in a way that make the player look good, and you just kid yourself, basically. So I think the key is to try and avoid them in the first place. Don't paint something beautiful that's not beautiful. There's a better way to say that, but that's the best I could do there. The last thing I'll mention here that I think I failed on was not having enough Man City and Liverpool players throughout the season. Best 2 teams in the league, score the most goals, keep the most clean sheets, get the most FPL points, get as many of them as you can. And even going into the final game week, I think I only had 4 from the 2 teams, and a lot of people had 6. So for me, again, going back to the seasons where I'd done well, I was very good at just focusing on the top teams in the league, and just having a sprinkle from the other lesser sides who offer good value. So I think next season I want to go into the season with a core 6, 7, 8 players from good sides who are just good FPL assets that can hopefully be set and forget for the season. And patience with those players. If you get in a good player from a good team and they blank for 5 or 6 games, doesn't mean they've become a bad player. And more often than not, if you just be patient with them, over the next 5 or 6 game weeks, they could score 50, 60 points easily. So again, a lot of it comes back to patience, and it's how you manage yourself in that situation. So I've touched on a few of the lessons already that I'm going to bring into the season. Just going to go through anything else I've got noted down here. I've already mentioned, number 1, make transfers with a fresh mind. If that means my head is fried on a Friday night, just go to sleep and wake up on Saturday fresh and make the transfers then. I don't know about other people. I always have this fear of sleeping in on a Saturday, even though the deadline's not till 11:30. I do like my sleep, and particularly if I'm out the night before, I just always have this fear of waking up at 11:35 on a Saturday, having not made my transfer. So that's really why I usually make them on a Friday night. It's very rare that something will crop up between Friday night at 10 or 11 o'clock and the Saturday deadline. So usually Friday night is a pretty safe time to make moves, and it's mainly because of my fear of sleeping in on a Saturday morning. What else am I going to take into the season? Avoid bandwagons, which I've mentioned. Just be strict with myself on that. Another thing I want to avoid next season is injury-prone players, which has caused me a lot of grief this year. The likes of Arnie and Danny Ings spring to mind there. So something I'm going to do before the season starts is I'm just going to make a list of injury-prone players. Players who've got a record of a lot of injuries. I'm thinking of Michael Antonio is another one that springs to mind. I didn't own him this season, but he would fall into this category. And just whenever I find myself considering a player who's injury-prone, just don't get him, because, as I said, you're wasting a transfer to get him in, and more than likely you're going to have to waste a transfer to get him out when he gets injured again. So that's 2 free transfers, very valuable 2 free transfers that could be used elsewhere. So that's something I want to do next season. So with that in mind, bandwagons and injury-prone players, I'm gonna next season, when it comes to making a transfer, I'm gonna have a checklist. So number 1, I'm gonna ask myself: Is the player I'm considering bringing in, is he likely to be rotated over the next couple of weeks? So an example there would be Barkley. So if I asked myself that question when I was getting Barkley, I would say the answer was yes, because there's Kovacic, Loftus-Cheek, there's lots of options there. So that would have straight away X for Barkley, not getting him. The next thing I'll ask myself is this player an injury-prone player? So if I was getting Danny Ings or Arnautovic, this would be an X there, and I would just avoid them and just go for someone else. The next question I would ask myself then is, the player I'm selling, have I given the player enough time? If I brought that player in for, with 5 or 6 game weeks in mind and only 3 of them have passed, and he's blanked in all three. Is it justified? Has his stats dropped off a cliff? How are the fixtures? Or should I give him those extra 3 weeks rather than getting this new player in? Again, it's all about minimising transfers. I think I made 42 transfers in total this year, which is probably a pretty low amount given the average. But again, I just want to go into next season and I made 38 last year, so an average of 1 a week, and I kind of have that figure in my head going into next season. Now, obviously, it depends on how many injuries and things like that you get, but really minimising transfers by managing my squad well is what has got me those top 500 finishes in the past. So that's something I want to try and go back to again next season, just focusing on having a core group of players, trust those players long term, and avoid the points hits. What else am I going to do next season? I'm going to listen to less FPL podcasts. I'm going to read less FPL articles. I'm going to watch less FPL videos. There's so much good content out there. But you've got to pick and choose what you watch and what you listen to. And I think you've got to limit it as well. And I think this works with Twitter and Reddit and things like that as well. It's very easy to become addicted to these forums and spend check it 5 or 6 times a day, and I'm guilty of doing that with Twitter. I think you've got to manage how much time you spend thinking about FPL, because otherwise you're just going to overthink, overmanage, and make poor decisions. So one thing I do on Twitter is I don't follow too many accounts. I follow about 200, but I also mute. I mute a lot of accounts. Anything I don't want to see, I just mute it, or mute the person. I just focus on, I want to use my Twitter for seeing the content that I want to see from the people who I respect and who provide good content. So, it's all about managing time as well. If you follow 500, 600, 700 Twitter accounts and you go on Twitter, you're gonna be there all day. When I log into Twitter, it probably takes me about 2 or 3 minutes to scroll down to where I was when I was last on there, because I follow so few, and I just mute the accounts that I don't want to see. And that way you're getting high quality content and you're not wasting time, and you're not clouding your judgment as well with other stuff there as well. So I think it's all about, you've got to be disciplined. I think nowadays with mobile phones, where a lot of us are guilty of just spending way too much time on them, and that's something I'm going to try cut back on next season as well, is less time on things like Twitter and Reddit. And I mean, the reason for that is I want to focus more on my own team and my own strategy, because if I'm looking at all kinds of websites and forums, I'm neglecting my own team and my own strategy and my own content, and I'm getting away from my own initial ideas. And usually your gut instinct, watching a game, and your gut instinct usually is, if you go with that, you won't be far wrong. It's when you start to overthink things and start taking other people's information on board too much, that's when you can that's when things get frustrating, because then you go with someone else's advice when you should have went with your own. And I think that's key. You've always got to go with your own advice. Take all the content on board, but at the end of the day, it's your team, and make the decisions that you feel are right, and not what other people are telling you what to do. What else am I going to do? Again, I mentioned I'm going to plan a lot better for game week 1, and have a strategy for the season, have a couple of golden rules and stick by them. And definitely that checklist for making transfers is something I'm going to refer to every Friday night. And if any player doesn't satisfy it, I just won't be making the transfer. I mentioned as well focusing on the top teams, again, something I haven't done enough this season. So going to move on now to the questions. I've got about 5 or 6 very good questions here. So I'll rattle through these as quickly as I can. The first one came from Alex Ball. So Alex is a fellow veteran in Elite 64 who is joining me in the relegation to the Elite 64 Qualifier League. So Alex is another top manager who's had a very tricky season. I'm pretty sure Alex has never been worse than 60k in about 10 years. And he's had a similar season to myself. So Alex's question is, with so many seasoned managers struggling this season, what do you think has changed from previous seasons, and how will you adapt next season based on what you've learned this season? So I've kind of covered what I've learned and what I'm going to do next season, but Alex asks what has changed. I don't think too much has changed within the game. We've still got the players. We still got the top, the best players score the most FPL points. I think the biggest thing that has changed is the readily available information for managers nowadays. And we've seen so many of the top 10k this season have never been there before. So the new breed have arrived, and I think when I think back to when I was an FPL manager for the first time, I didn't have Twitter. I didn't look at any forums. All I did was watch Match of the Day on a Saturday night and manage my FPL team off that. There was no podcasts, no articles, none of that crack. Nowadays, if you're a new FPL manager, you can come in next season. If you're coming in next season as a new manager, never played the game before, you could easily not watch a single game. You could read a couple of articles a week, listen to 1 or 2 FPL podcasts a week, and then make your transfers, and you could easily. You could win FPL. You could win FPL by not watching the game. It is possible. So I think that's the biggest thing that has changed. There's so much information out there nowadays, and the biggest challenge, I think, is how you manage yourself and how you manage that information. I think, talking about veteran managers like myself and Alex who've had tough seasons, I'm sure Alex will probably say the same thing as me. Back in the day, go back 4 or 5 years ago, it was so much easier to play the game because it was so much less noise and you just did your own thing. But again, definitely the competition is fierce now. It's getting harder and harder every season to get those top 10k finishes. I've got 3 top 500 finishes, and I really don't expect to get one again, to be honest, given how good the competition is out there. You need to have a phenomenal season nowadays with over 6 million managers to get the top 500 finish. So very, very challenging, and it's only going to get harder and harder as the seasons go on for us veterans. So do we stick to our tried and trusted strategies, or do we adjust? But for me, I'm not going to change too much next season. I'm going to stick to what I've always done. I've always been a conservative manager, avoiding point sets, waiting for Fridays, all that kind of stuff. So I won't be changing too much next season. I think probably something that has changed for me in the last 3 years, and more so than any this year, is being in the public eye as well. I think that definitely comes with its own challenge. When you're doing TV shows, when you're on podcasts, when you've got a big following on Twitter, every move you make is scrutinised. But I think for me, I don't think that has affected me too much. I don't post my team on Twitter until after the deadline. So again, I think that helps me, because I think it would be harder to make certain moves if you had to post your team, an hour before the deadline. And all the criticism and the question marks would come with it. But I don't think that has affected me too much. But there definitely are challenges. Being in the public eye definitely comes with its own challenges, and that's something I need to manage better next season as well. Next question is from Sofa King. Do you think your conservative/patient play style maybe hurt you this season? Maybe an aggressive 8-point hit at some point before Christmas might have helped correct the course. So a very good question here again. And I think my conservative patient approach definitely did hurt me this season. I was in a position where I had to chase, which I'd never really been in before. So I was out of my comfort zone. And I decided to, when you're way back in the rankings, you've got to decide whether you stick to what you know, or do you change up your strategy and go for broke and take point hits and all that kind of thing. I decided to just stick with my approach and see how it went for the season, and it obviously didn't go very well. So in hindsight, I mentioned I didn't take any -8s this season. In hindsight, maybe I should have been more aggressive, given that I was, especially when you're down 300, 400, 500k with only a couple of weeks to go. Maybe I should have just went all out and had a real go at it. So I think in future, if I ever find myself, fingers crossed I won't. Fingers crossed I won't find myself in the position I was in this season. Having such a terrible season. But I think if I did, I think I would be more inclined to maybe be more aggressive, because the conservative approach didn't work for me this season. So I think when you've got nothing to lose, you may as well just go for it. And I do think, possibly a couple of -8s here and there may have, steadied the ship for me. I don't think it would have saved my season, but it may have improved things. Next question is from Joe Paul Shonsky. Good question here. How important psychologically and tactically do you think a good start to the season is? So I found myself having a very poor start. And I definitely do think that affected me psychologically and tactically, because I think if you have a good start to the season, it's very easy to just, be a lot more confident and just keep doing what you're doing. But if you have a very bad start to the season, that's when you start to overthink things and try and second guess yourself because you doubt yourself because you've made poor choices for the first couple of weeks. So something I am really determined to do next season is to have a good start. And having a quick look at Elite 64 as well, I need to look at this in more detail, but I often find, the players that finish very highly in the rankings, if you look back at their season history, a large proportion of them had a very good start to the season. So I do think a good start is very, very important. It's not essential. We see it all the time. People claw back from 1 million to finish top 10k, but I think a good start, sets you up in good stead for the season, because if you've had a good start, you've more than likely got most of the good players in already, so you can focus your transfers around the fringes. You don't have to do much shaking up. And if you have a good start as well, you can probably save your first wildcard for a little bit longer as well, which can be an advantage too. So I do think a good start is very important, and it's something I'm hoping to achieve next season. Next question was from Alan Cooper. Alan asked, what 3 things do you think you could have / should have done differently? So the 3 things that spring to mind here are: number 1, keep Salah for Christmas. I sold Salah game week 18 to get Sterling and Sané in, and Salah went on a run of 49 points for the next 5 weeks, while Sterling and Sané scored 4 points each over the next 2 game weeks. When City lost those 2 games just before Christmas. So that's one thing I would have done. I would have kept Salah. I was probably a bit knee-jerk in selling him. I kept him for the hat-trick against Bournemouth, captained him, 42 points. Then he played United and got nothing and didn't look great. But Salah never does much against the top sides. Well, United, we're not really even a top side anymore. But I was probably too quick to sell him, and it was the fear of Man City assets drove that transfer. Sané and Sterling were hurting me every week, and I decided to get both of them in instead of having Salah, and obviously that backfired big time. So keeping Salah is one thing I would have done differently. Number 2 would be, I've mentioned it a few times, more focus on Liverpool and City assets, having more of them more often. And number 3, I probably, looking back, I would have been more aggressive, especially in the last couple of weeks when things were not going well. So, maybe more points hits and a few more punts here and there. Good questions. Cheers, Alan. Next question is from Martin Squires. Is the save the second wildcard for the double game week outdated given the increased rotation we see now? And should we use the second wildcard earlier to get more from it? So that's definitely something I'm going to think about next season, especially because my second wildcard was a bit of a failure this year. A lot of people who played their second wildcard earlier, just after Christmas, just after the new year, ended up doing very well from it. And I always like an early wildcard because you get a lot more game weeks to benefit from it. So definitely something I'll be thinking about next season is possibly playing the second wildcard earlier, because rotation is a nightmare. And, this crack of wildcarding and then bench boosting the week after, I don't think it's ever worked out very well for me. So I'm always open to new ideas with that one. I know a lot of people, every summer people talk about bench boosting in game week 1, because essentially it's the only week where you have a wildcard and a bench boost in the same game week, because you can set up your game week 1 team and then bench boost. But again, that's not for me, because there's too many question marks game week 1. You're not guaranteed to get 15 starters because you've got no previous information to go on. So but definitely I'm always flexible with chips and things like that, so it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out next season. But definitely I'm open to an earlier second wildcard next year. Next question from John Chappell, a very loyal listener this season. John, thank you for the questions every week. 2 questions from John. First one is, which players do I have penciled in for next season? And the answer is, my pencil is not even out yet. I'm not even thinking about which players I'm going to have in game week 1 next season until we get the fixtures and until we get the player prices, because player prices really dictates everything. So the fixtures are announced on the 13th of June, so at least then we can start thinking about which teams to target for the first couple of weeks, and then hopefully early July we will have the player prices. It's been early July. It's been the first week of July the last couple of seasons when FPL's relaunched, but hopefully the fact that we've had have a barren summer, they might treat us and give it to us early or late June instead. So fingers crossed. But yeah, I'm not thinking about game week 1 team until I have fixtures and player prices. The next podcast after this one will be going to take a break from the 59th minute podcast for the summer. And once the game relaunches, then I'll do a podcast that week, with my initial thoughts on some players that I like price wise and maybe some that I don't like. John's second question was what effect will VAR have next season? Yeah, so VAR is coming in. Will we have more penalties? Will we have less penalties? There's a lot of debate about that at the minute. There was a very interesting graphic I posted on Twitter yesterday from the FPL show. Go check that one out on VAR from La Liga, Bundesliga and the Serie A, and how it affected things there. And in 2 of those leagues, the penalties dropped off in the following season. And I think it was La Liga. Just one of the leagues anyway, penalties went up. I think it was La Liga. So I don't think VAR will affect things too much. We could see a bit of a spike possibly the first few weeks like we did in the World Cup. And then it tails off and it evens out then. But I don't think VAR will influence my game week 1 team at all. I've always liked penalty takers in FPL, and I don't think that's going to change for the better or for the worse next season. So we're definitely going to have managers out there who are going to pick 7 or 8 attackers who are all penalty takers, and it could well pay off for the first few weeks. So it's going to be very interesting to see how VAR does affect FPL. But for me, I don't think it'll change things too much. Last question I will tackle is from Milan Dobrocic. Milan asks, how do I approach building my game week 1 team? So I said, I don't have any players in mind, but when it comes to building a game week 1 team, a couple of things I do is, number 1, I tend to avoid the promoted teams. Jota was the only one I got last season. Wolves were a bit of an exception because they were coming up as a very, very good side. I don't think we're going to have that this season with the likes of Norwich, Sheffield United and whoever else gets promoted. So game week 1 this season, I'll be avoiding the 3 promoted teams completely. Give them a couple of weeks and see then if there's any gems there, because more than likely when you get a game week 1 promoted player, you're going to have to transfer them out after a couple of weeks, because chances are they won't deliver. So to me, that's a wasted transfer. You're setting yourself up already to waste a transfer. So on the flip side, game week 1, I always tend to focus on tried and trusted FPL players. Focus on the teams I think are going to perform well for the first couple of weeks. So this season, last season I think I set up looking at the first 4 game weeks. I think this season or next season I'll probably look at a bit of longer stretch, maybe 6 to 8 game weeks for fixtures when I'm building my game week 1 team. But I'll talk a lot more about that in the pre-season podcasts. Thanks for the questions, folks. Hopefully you found some of this useful. You can chew on it for the summer and come back to it maybe when you're building your game week 1 team. Thanks, a huge thanks for listening this season. It blows me away that so many people take a half an hour or 40 minutes out of their week to listen to my views. So it really means a lot. A big shout out to my patrons for their support this season. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to keep the Patreon going during the summer. I am going to wind down from Twitter and things like that for a couple of weeks, but I am going to continue doing Patreon content for the loyal addicts like myself who are sticking around for the summer. So I'm doing an Ask Me Anything podcast this evening on Patreon. So no FPL questions are allowed there from patrons. So lots of good questions. So that should be a good podcast. It's going to be nice to do a podcast that is non-FPL related. So basically it's a chance to get to know me better. And my plan for Patreon for the summer is to do a back to basics. Basically it's a back to basics generals boot camp. So for me, after a poor season, I'm going to go back to basics and, I'm going to do hopefully 1 or 2 podcasts a week on just the basics of FPL. Start from the rules, talk about wildcards, talk about price changes, protecting team value, all that kind of stuff. Just cover all aspects of the game, really from a basic approach, because it'll suit people who are new to the game, but I think it's good for any manager to remind themselves of the basics. I'll go through what's worked well for me over the seasons as well. So looking forward to doing that content during the summer. It'll probably be in the form of short podcasts, 10, 15, 20 minute podcasts on different aspects of FPL. So that should be good. And if you want to check those out during the summer, you can sign up at the lowest Patreon pledge level. The $2 pledge level will get you all that content during the summer. So if you need your fix of content, check that out in May and June. Enjoy the break. We all need a break. Enjoy the summer, whatever you're up to. Enjoy the FA Cup, enjoy the Champions League, and before we know it, the game will be relaunched and the tinkering will have commenced. So again, thanks for listening, folks, and enjoy your summer break.